verses 21, and we will go through verse 34. Randy, we're ready? Sweet. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went to the synagogue and began to preach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then, a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him." News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Last week, we started our service with a simple question: is what gives Jesus the right to claim to be the Messiah or the Anointed King? And we mentioned last week, this is especially difficult to think about because multiple people at the time of Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Jesus isn't alone in that claim. In fact, the historian Josephus says that there were at least 12 people in the lifetime of Jesus who claimed to be the Messiah. So what makes Jesus any different? We saw last week in our text that Jesus speaks words that have authority. And if you read the Gospels, you'll find out that he claims authority with his words in four ways. One, he equates his words to the Old Testament law. He says, this is what the Old Testament law says. This is what I say you should do instead. Or this is a way to interpret it instead. Secondly, he forgives people of their sins as if he was the chief party offended. We said last week, if Randy came up here and slapped me in the head and called me stupid, Ruth could not say, "Randy, I forgive you for what you did," because you're not the chief party offended. I am. But Jesus claims every sin committed is chiefly against him. And we're like, well, why would you claim that? The only one that could claim that is God. Thirdly, we saw that his words speak action and life into existence. Jesus says, "Be healed," the person's healed. Fourthly, Jesus claims to be God, and he claimed to be equal to God and called God his Father. But as we said, when it comes to talk, we have the phrase, talk is cheap. You can say anything you want to. I could say I'm the best basketball player in the world. But if you've ever played basketball with me, you know that I'm actually probably the worst basketball player in the world. I could say that I am the most sensitive person in the world and that my words never hurt people's feelings. But my wife would say, "You're so sweet." I put you in an awkward place. I have a difficult time being sensitive. That's true. Talk is cheap, isn't it? So if Jesus is going to claim all these things, what do we probably need to see Jesus do? We need to see him prove it. And so can Jesus back up what he has claimed to say? So following his teaching in Capernaum, as soon as he's done, a man enters the synagogue who is possessed with an in some translations it says evil. Does the translation say evil spirit in theirs? All right, some say evil. The old NIV, gets confusing. The old New International Version says evil. The New International Version has translated it now to impure or unclean. And this spirit comes in and cries out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." So a couple things to note about our text. One, this is kind of a quick aside, an interpretive aside, if you will. The Greek word pneumatai akatharto best translates as unclean or impure. The word akatharto gets at the idea that you've tainted it with something. So it'd be like getting dirt and something and mixing it up. And it's like, oh, I can't drink that now. It's no longer clean. And so that would be why there's a translation issue. But what's interesting is the idea of the impure spirit or the unclean spirit actually helps develop the text a little bit more And overall, it teaches us the full meaning of what Jesus is trying to do. When we think of an evil spirit, we might just think, oh, this is a villainous character, or this is a character opposed to God, or this is this demonic entity, which are all true. But the idea of the unclean spirit gets at the idea that this is a defiled spirit. And by being in this person, that person is now defiled. Once that demon-possessed person comes into the synagogue, guess what that synagogue is now? It is also defiled. Any person that this defiled, impure spirit touches will become defiled. This is a thing that it's kind of like, how many of you guys, does anyone paint? I love to paint. My wife said, I always tell people I'm a professional painter. My wife always says, you're a sloppy painter. I am so messy, and I try not to be. But the other, as I'm painting my classroom at the school, and I got everything, and I was so proud because there was no drop at all, and the room was spotless. And I said, great. And so I had taken my painting clothes to school to change into, and I had my dress clothes in a Walmart bag, and I wiped my paint hands on my shirt. And I said, okay, I won't touch my dress clothes to my shirt and I'll be okay. And so I go in the bathroom and I take off the paint clothes and I put on my dress clothes again. And I get back to my classroom and I'm like spotless. And I look, and on my black pants, I have a big blue streak of paint. And I said, how in the world? And it's because if you guys know anything about paint, paint is very messy. And Shelly would say professionals aren't messy, but maybe I'm good. Anyway, I digress. Anyway, I had paint on my pants that I was unaware of. And so I got paint from my painting pants to my clean pants. And that's kind of how impurity works. So if something is impure or unclean, if it bumps into something, it makes that thing unclean. So if I'm wearing my paint pants covered in paint and I bump into my dress pants, which I did, that transfers its paint to them. And then if I put my black pants on, and then I rub my hand against the pants, which is how I found out they were dirty. That dress pants now transferred paint to my hand. And so unclean things have the ability in the Old Testament to transfer their impurity to three things. So if this guy touches this object, that object could touch something and make it impure, and so on. And so this impure spirit is a defiling spirit that defiles people, places, and things. So we need to know that this is a story of defilement. Secondly, it is interesting that the evil spirit calls Jesus by his name, Jesus of Nazareth, the Holy One of God. And one of my commentaries, it had mentioned that by calling on Jesus' name, that this may have been the impure spirit's way of trying to control Jesus. For those of you who know anything about ancient Near Eastern magic, you know that they believed if you could say the right name for the god or the right name for the spirit, you could control them. That's why if you ever get bored and you're like, oh, I want to be a nerd today, and you want to read the Enuma Elish, the Mesopotamian creation narrative, anytime it mentions a god, it gives this long list of names because they believed if you can memorize this set of names, you can control that god and they do whatever you want. And so there's a possibility that that's maybe what this impure spirit's trying to do. Jesus of Nazareth, the Holy One of God, is trying to control Jesus and manipulate him. I would suggest that we know for a fact that God cannot be manipulated. In fact, that's why one of the reasons God says, don't take my name in vain. You can't manipulate me. You cannot control me and force me to do things by calling on my name. I would suggest that we need to be careful with how we use Jesus' name when we pray. Just simply saying in Jesus' name at the end of a prayer does not magically make God say, oh, I wasn't going to do this because that wasn't my will, but you said it. I've got to do it. So we just be careful. God cannot be manipulated or controlled. And you might say, Jeff, does it specifically say that the impure spirit tries to manipulate Jesus? And I would say it does not say it. And as always, we don't assign motive where motive is not given. All right. But what we can say is this, is that Jesus is not manipulated in this story, and he's not controlled in this story. In fact, it's quite the opposite, that Jesus is the one giving the orders in this passage. This impure spirit is talking to Jesus. What does he say? He says, be quiet. Guess what the impure spirit does? He quiets down. He doesn't say anything else. He doesn't dialogue with Jesus. He doesn't make any orders. He doesn't have any arguments. He's just immediately silent. And then when Jesus says, come out, the evil spirit does immediately. Now, think about how many guys like taking off Band-Aids. This is the word. Like I don't know why this isn't against the Geneva war crimes. Pulling off a Band-Aid is the worst experience in the world. And if you disagree with me, we need to put a Band-Aid on you and tell you to leave it on for a couple days. Because how many of you guys are cowards when it comes to taking off Band-Aids? I'll be honest, I hate it. And like when I know the Band-Aid needs to come off, it's like a 3-day process. Day 1, I start pushing around it to try to get the edges up, and then I leave it. Day 2, I'll push it a little bit more. I might get a little bit of rubbing alcohol, and then I start like trying to destroy the adhesive that's holding it together. And then the last day is there's that bunch of hair. And some of you might not struggle with it. I'm a very hairy man. You don't want to know that. I'm sorry, but it's true. It's like on day 3, some of my arm hairs have formed a romantic bond with that Band-Aid and don't want to let go. The scissors come out. Randy's laughing because I feel like we're on the same page, Randy. You've had this. And it's like, I just got to snip those. But guess what? At no point in my 3-day process have I said, ouch. At no point have I cried. At no point have I whimpered. Nice and smooth. However, if on day 1 I'm pushing the edges up and Brenda sees me and says, you know what, Jeff, how long is this going to take? Brenda, this is a 3-day process. Please don't interrupt. I would scream my head off, Brenda, and I would shout, and I would be in tremendous pain. And for 5 brief seconds, I would probably say, Brenda, you're not my friend. But then I would say, Brenda, we're friends again because I like you. You're very nice. So when this impure spirit is taken out, it's not a slow process. Take your time. Impure spirit, why don't you come out of this guy as slowly and painlessly as possible? It says it cries out with a shriek, indicating that this is probably sudden and forceful. Jesus' word demands immediate response. There's no conflict. And you could say this, Jesus is the boot to the impure spirit's ant. Whatever Jesus says happens. Jesus has authority. The spirit, the devil, the evil one does not. I think we would do well as God's people to remind ourselves that Jesus has authority and that we do not control Jesus, because I think sometimes, and we might not say this out loud, but I think sometimes we can convince ourselves that we can control Jesus, that we're the ones who call the shots, that Jesus does what we say. Maybe we think in our minds that Jesus is kind of, and I know we would never call Jesus a dog, so this probably is not a good illustration, but sometimes maybe we believe that we can lead Jesus around as if he was a dog on a leash. But the reality is we cannot. Jesus cannot be controlled. Jesus does not submit to our will and our desire. And in the words of the Newsboys in their song, Who, I'm not following a God I can lead around. I can't tame this deity. That's why Jesus is the final answer to who I want my God to be. He's who I want my God to be. How are you going to reckon with a God this great? How are you going to measure what you can't equate? What you're going to say to the checkmate that is our God? I wonder how often, though, we do try to give Jesus orders. And we say, Jesus, this is what you're going to do. And we maybe expect, Jesus, this is what I want you to do. And I'll trust you to do what I've told you to do. That we expect Jesus to embrace our understanding of his words. A phrase I often like to use is that we turn Jesus from this wonderful, powerful king into what I call happy hippie Jesus. Just this cool dude who, you know what, Mitchell, if that's what you want to do, cool, man. Randy, if this is what you want to do, cool. Who am I to get in your way? Jeffrey, if this is what, cool, man. Or sometimes I think we try to declaw and defang the line of the tribe of Judah. And we try to turn God from this wonderful king into basically someone who just grants our every wish and desire. And I think we have to be careful that we don't do that. Because sometimes you'll bump into people and it seems like their life's a mess. And when you're talking to them, it's just like, man, you're living for the devil, but you expect God to make everything hunky-dory and perfect. That's a difficult thing to reconcile. That maybe truly if we want God to lead our lives and guide our lives, maybe we just have to humbly say, God, you're in control. Secondly, the unclean spirit acknowledges that Jesus has the authority and the power to destroy all that's evil. Immediately, once this impure spirit sees Jesus, he's like, oh man, it's judgment day. I'm destroyed. And a common theme throughout the Old Testament is God's judgment. You could even probably say this. A common theme through the whole Bible is God's judgment. The book of Revelation is rife with God's judgment on people. This is Psalm 9, verses 7 through 8. The Lord reigns forever. He has established his throne for judgment. He will judge the world in righteousness. He will govern the peoples with justice. How many of you guys would say that sounds great? When God's coming to judge those other people, you know who I'm talking about. Those other people. Isn't that great? How many guys would, that idea sounds good. You know, that person who cuts you off, God's going to judge them one day. Yes. Or the person who messed up your order 3 times at the restaurant, they're going to get judged one day. Yes. How many of you guys would say, man, I can't wait for God to judge me? That's different, isn't it? But notice what Psalm 7 says. This is verses 8 through 9. The Lord judges his people. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity that's in me. How many of you guys would say that sounds crazy? Inviting God to judge you. That sounds crazy to me, Ellie. So what does it mean for God to judge? When we think of judgment, we typically think of some kind of justice system where a judge is going to judge us and then there's going to be a penalty to follow. However, the Hebrew word shafat means more the idea of establishing order or putting things back where they should go. The best way to illustrate this, and some of you might find this hard to believe, I'm kind of an unorganized guy. Like my game shelf is organized, but my side of the bedroom is not. And up until this week, my classroom was not organized. I struggle with it. And I'm very busy, and it's easier just to throw something on my dresser, and it's like, I'll put it up later. But then 158 put that up later has become, there's a Mount Everest of stuff. And Shelly might say to me, can you get to that? And I'll say, I'll get to it when I'm not busy. I'm always busy. And so one day I came home and I opened up our bedroom door and the floor was clean. And I said, oh my, what's happened? Because I know I had clothes here. And then I went on my side of the bed and my side of the bed was clean and my dresser was clean. And I tried to find a mess in my room and it was all gone. And I said, Shelly, what happened? And she said, I put everything where it goes. That is the idea of the Hebrew word shafat, or the word that we translate in English to judgment. It's the idea that finally the judge comes and he's going to put everything where it goes. He's going to establish order. He's going to establish peace. He's going to take anything that should not be there and put where it goes. Thank you for cleaning my side of the room, my love, by the way. In case, I think I said it, but I'll say it on the internet, which makes it true and forever. But anyway, when we think of this idea as Jesus' judgment is going into a situation and putting things where it should be or establishing order, we see that beautifully in our passage. Jesus has come to establish his kingdom, and part of his ministry of building his kingdom is those things that should not be there are removed. So Jesus tells us in Luke 4, he says that he has come to remove oppression, disease, and bondage. Those things should not be in God's kingdom, and he has come to push them out. So in our story, when this impure spirit comes into the presence of a pure God, purity and impurity cannot go together. And so what does Jesus do with this impure spirit? He casts it out. He gets it out of his presence. And notice that that's not only in this story, like this story, and it's interesting that Mark starts off his gospel with this. It's interesting that this is basically everything Jesus is going to do. He's going to go to people who suffer from deafness and muteness, from blindness, from having crippled body parts, people who are sick, people who are diseased, and he is going to push that out of his presence. And when we get to verse 29, it says, after pushing or getting rid of this impure spirit, Jesus goes to Simon's house. Simon's mom is sick with a fever. And notice what it says. It doesn't say that he heals her. What does it say happens to the fever? The fever leaves her. It's not disappeared, it's pushed out of the presence of Jesus. It's cast away. Following this, a huge crowd comes to meet Jesus. Mark tells us that basically everyone in the area brings sick people and demon-possessed people. And notice what it says about the demons. It says that he drives them out. He pushes them out of his presence. That's why we proclaim the good news. What does it mean for Jesus to be the king? It means that he goes into areas that are occupied by evil, by greed, by the evil one, by selfishness, by shame, sin, guilt, all these things, and he pushes those out. Our culture is obsessed with death and evil. What does Jesus come to do with death and evil? He wants to push it out of his kingdom. What does Jesus do with guilt and helplessness? He pushes it out and hopelessness. Jesus is the king who has arrived to put an end to all human suffering. He's driving it out. Now, you may have noticed, and this is, I'm a Bible nerd. Let's just say what it is. My favorite things in the Bible are merisms. Is there anyone in this congregation who would be brave enough on the internet to stand up and say, here's what a merism is, because we're tired of hearing your voice. Give us a little break. Oh, young man, what's a merism? And give me an example.
A merism is when you use two opposite ideas to display the totality of what you're trying to say.
That's a mouthful. I wish you could give me a good example.
Okay, so for example, when you say that you search high and low for something, high and low are opposites. So you're saying that you search everywhere for it. You're saying that you search high and you search low and everywhere in between.
Exactly. As if you had been taught by someone brilliant previously to say that.
Rory is quite brilliant.
It's on the internet. It's true now. Rory, you're a genius. Good job. Good job, sir. Yes. So a merism is when you say two ideas that are opposites, and it means everything in between. So Jesus is the Alpha. He's the Omega, meaning Jesus is everything. Jesus is the first, which that's what Alpha and Omega mean. First, last, everything in between. So notice in our story, when we look at Jesus' authority, is that the people say that Jesus' words have authority. And when he does actions and casts this impure spirit out, his actions have authority. So Jesus' words, his actions, and everything in between have authority. Jesus is full of authority. Jesus is able to heal people spiritually from these impure spirits. Jesus is able to heal people physically. So what does that mean? Jesus can heal everything. There's nothing that Jesus cannot heal. And so it's interesting that when Jesus comes into Israel, his goal is to restore the kingdom of God. And when we see him restoring the kingdom of God, that means pushing out those things that should not be there and restoring those people's lives that have been broken by those things. Seems to be his primary purpose in establishing his kingdom on earth. And so Jesus is using his authority to restore lives and establish his kingdom. So I wonder if maybe we can ask this: if Jesus' goal is to restore life and to push out things that shouldn't be there, maybe there's things in our life that need restored. Maybe things in our life that just need Jesus to come in with his authority and rebuild them up. Maybe, and this is just a few examples I thought of beforehand, maybe we could say, maybe how we treat our children, that needs restored. Or maybe our marriages need restored. Or maybe our whole life needs restored. Maybe there's an aspect of your life that just seems completely out of control that we need Jesus to come in and restore it. When I was in high school, that's what brought me to Jesus. My life was so out of control, and my friends' lives, it seemed like their lives were out of control. And I was like, I don't want to be like that. And it just seemed like everything I thought that I had control over, it was just slipping out of my grasp. And I needed someone to come in my life and establish some kind of order and restore my life to what it should be. And the only answer that seemed to be lasting was Jesus. And so I would suggest that if it seems like any aspect of your life is spiraling out of control, allow Jesus to restore it. Allow him to mend your life back to what it should be. However, in order for us to truly allow Jesus to mend our life, we have to give him authority over our life to mend it. How do you guys know that phrase? And maybe you've got a bumper sticker or a keychain or a card in your wallet. That phrase that says, "Be still and know that I am God." Anyone ever hear that phrase before? It's from Psalm 46. It's interesting that the Hebrew phrase "be still" literally means to take your hands off. Take your hands off the situation and let God show you that He's God. Because what typically happens, we like to cling to things, don't we? We like to cling to our life as tightly as possible. And it seems like when Jesus says, "Hey, I'd like you to give that to me," what do? We typically, it's kind of like, how many, you guys know I like sweets. I love sweets. You want to make me happy on a bad day, give me sweets. I love them. But if I know that I have sweets, like sometimes Shelly will give me a bag of snacks to take to school. And you know what happens at school when kids see that you have snacks? It's like throwing blood in a pool of sharks. And so I double wrap my snacks in a bag and then I try to smuggle them in. And if I see kids that are notorious for taking snacks from their friends, I cling to it even tighter and I cram it and I smash it and I hide it because I don't want anyone to touch my stuff. But I'm afraid that's what we do with Jesus sometimes, that when Jesus says, "Hey, I'd like you to give me that area of your life because I want to restore it." And instead of saying, "Jesus, I want to take my hands off and give it to you," we cling to that tighter and tighter and tighter, don't we? And the more Jesus talks about being the king and more about being the one who wants to restore things and mend things, the more tighter and tighter we make that thing in our life. If Jesus is going to be the king of our life, we have to give him our life. If we're going to ask Jesus to restore aspects of our life, we have to give him those aspects of our life to restore. How many, and maybe this is just because I'm a dude, but how many of you guys hate to let other people try to help? I will do it on my own until I either break it or I've hurt myself in the process. Asking for help is the absolute last thing I want to do. And so I'm not surprised that when we have to ask for spiritual help, what do we typically do? Maybe my marriage is a mess and I could very easily give it to Jesus, but I'm going to try to make this work even harder. And the harder we try to make something work, what typically happens to it? It usually gets, unless you're Jesse. Jesse makes everything better. But typically for most of us, we work and we make things worse. And so I would suggest this, that if we truly want our lives to be completely restored, it's going to include us giving our lives to Jesus. And not just, the fun one is this: "Jesus, take my sins away." That's the easy one to say. But after a while, Jesus is like, I don't want to just take your sins. I want to take everything. I want your life to be given to me so that I can restore it and mend it to what it should be. And so what we're going to do today is I've asked Randy to cue up All Hail King Jesus for us. And I was listening to Alistair Begg this week, who's a much better preacher than I could ever be in 1,000 years. And he was talking about the end of service. And he said, one thing that we can do is when it's time to end the service, after you've got done preaching your sermon, don't let everyone just rush out as fast as they can. Make them sit and think about what you've asked them to do. And so, Randy, we're going to play through that a couple of times. And we're not going to sing it. Maybe we'll just listen to it as we sing about Jesus being our king. Will you guys, over the next couple seconds, if not minutes, will you ask God a very simple yet dangerous question? God, will you flip through my life and show me any areas of my life that I've not given to you? Is that an easy question to ask? It's easy to say. Is it hard to do? So can we pray that as a congregation? God, show me any area in my life that I've not given to you that needs to be restored, that I've held onto it as tight as I can instead of giving it to you. And then we'll close out in prayer.